Let me tell you about this video that you're about to see. We found this tape in the archives at Emory University where we have Father Thomas's works. It was recorded December 5th, 2001, the year of 9/11, as one of the talks that Father Thomas was giving for to be part of part 5 of the Spiritual Journey tapes. It seems that after he recorded it and we reviewed it, he thought it was repetitious and also, too, that in a certain sense, it didn't meet the standards of the other tapes, and so it was not included. Now, the original plan for part 5 would have been 6 presentations, but when he said he didn't want this, it ended up that part 5 had only 5 presentations. And the work that we did at this tape went to the archives. Well, when we went back and looked at it, it looked fine for us. And we were pleased with the fact that how this message, even though the standards weren't up to Thomas's standards, they certainly were up to ours. Because his message 25 years later, is still very poignant. And the topic is a good topic, the human condition revisited. So here we are presenting it to you. We know the Lord will touch you and bless you, and you're listening to it. And sorry, Father Thomas, we didn't follow your directions, but sometimes it's good not to follow directions. God bless.
What is the situation that the divine therapy addresses? I described in a little bit how a prayer in secret, if we accept the invitation to enter the inner room, initiates a dynamic that might be called the divine therapy. And this involves two things. One is friendship with God based on a commitment to this process, manifested by the daily practice of centering prayer twice a day. And the other is the willingness to be healed of the deep wounds of the human condition. I'm afraid that most of us don't really have a clear idea of how profoundly we need healing. And that's what I think might be helpful at this point in our exposition, to look at the disease that the divine therapy addresses with such extraordinary kindness, love, and accuracy. First of all, we're thinking about human nature just as it is. It is to this that contemplative prayer addresses itself. That's why it's perhaps the most realistic tool in the whole armory of Christian or values or exercises. It accepts human nature just as it is. Well, let's take a look at what just as it is really means in the concrete. First of all, everybody comes into this world in the utmost fragility. There's no more fragile creature than a baby. And we're pretty certain now that the emotional life of the child begins even in the womb. And so it can sense whether it's wanted or not wanted. And the attitudes and the emotional stability of the parents probably have a significant effect on how the child is going to appear when it enters the world. Well, entering this world is not the most pleasant experience. There's a lot of interesting research been going on in the last generation or two about rebirthing. In some psychotherapies or self-help groups, they bring people back to the moment of birth and go through once again the traumatic experience of being pushed out of this marvelous environment. Perhaps there is no better environment in all of creation than the marvelous situation in which the infant has been in, taken care of, at least by normal parents, with all kinds of consideration, expectation, and love. And so when this poor little thing is thrust out and the labor pains begin, it is leaving behind the most wonderful environment, and hence it's experiencing for the first time a kind of death. And this is one of the most profound archetypes in the whole of human psychic reality. The whole of life seems to be a process of birth, death, and rebirth. And this seems to be the whole human experience. Well, anyway, when this poor little creature arrives in the delivery room, until very recently, it was surrounded by these terribly bright lights. It's never seen lights before. It enjoyed the quiet darkness of the womb. It's surrounded by these creatures running around who are masked and carrying sharp tools, and some rebirthings that are reported in the literature tell us that this fear of the sharp instruments that they saw or experienced in early birth may have stayed with them as something close to a phobia as their lives unfolded. Well, then the baby is grabbed, or it used to be grabbed from the mother and stuffed into a bassinet and inoculated with all kinds of stuff. And the time that it spends with its mother used to be quite limited. And of course, if it arrives too soon, then it gets thrust into an incubator. Well, it's the only way to save the life of the child. We can't complain about that. But we can't change either the effects this has on the child. Because besides eating and drinking, the child needs above all else affection, and not just any words of affection, but the tactile expression of affection, the caressing, the cuddling, and the holding. So there was this, in my youth, this doctor who was supposed to be a great pediatrician, and his research taught him that mother's milk is not all that it should be. It's not as good as other mammals have. And so he developed these formulas, and he recommended, for instance, against breastfeeding because there's no doubt mother's milk seems to be a little thinner and less, and provides less nutrients than other mammals are aimed at providing. Well, the only problem with this doctor and his scientific empirical evidence was that he neglected the psychological factor in the birthing and the sustaining of an infant in earlier years. And so he didn't realize that nature has deliberately made mother's milk a little thin so that she has to pick the baby up and nurse it more often. And it's this picking it up that is just as important as the blessed milk. And so there's some sort of combinations now. But this same doctor, I believe, also had the idea that you shouldn't feed the baby in the middle of the night, because now it was getting the proper formula from his marvelous invention of reinforcing mother's milk. So the net result was that when the babies cried at night, they weren't really crying for food, but for affection. And he believed they should be disciplined and not depend on food. And so all of these significant Park Avenue mothers who were very well-to-do, of course, jumped on this bandwagon of this very expensive pediatrician. And so there was a whole generation of young people raised with a certain level of pervasive indignation or anger because of the affection that was withheld from them, and they yelled and yelled and yelled, and no one would give them any milk or pick them up. Well, I belong to this generation, but through the mercy of God, I had a nurse, and she had enough sense to completely disregard this over-educated doctor, as the case may be. And so all my friends, though, suffered from being a little grumpy, or they had a certain low level of anger that seemed to go on. And so if it hadn't been for this nurse, I would be a dreadful person too. In any case, the story has a happy ending, if you could call it happy. I believe on his deathbed, he retracted, and he realized he'd made a mistake, and so he said, I was wrong, and I didn't take this psychological need of the infant for the experience of love and of being held and the attention that it needs. Just to emphasize that once more, to dwell a moment more on the delicacy and fragility of the infant's emotional life and how this affects its progress of its emotional development throughout life and even life itself. There was a picture in the newspaper not long ago with a little story about two twins who were born too soon and were put in separate incubators in order to provide them with plenty of chance to life. And one looked as though it was a little stronger and it was going to make it. The other was slipping and it was losing day by day and didn't seem to have any vitality, any will to live. And so this nurse in the hospital got the idea, well, why don't we put the two babies together and see what happens? So they put the two of them in the same incubator. And this picture shows the two of them on their tummies, fast asleep. And the one that was strong has its little arm around the shoulders of the one who was weak. That's all you see in the picture, this little arm around the shoulder of its twin. And sure enough, in a few days, the one that was dying started to get better, and eventually both got well. Well, what does that say? It says the baby doesn't need much, but it has to have some sign of affection, acceptance, receptivity, affirmation, or protection. So basically, we all come into the world with three basic human needs. The need for survival and security that leads to it, the need for affection, physical affection in the case of the infant, and probably adults too, if their defense mechanisms didn't sort of make them think they didn't need such things. And finally, power and control. This need appears in the demand for the prompt fulfillment of the child's needs, which it makes you know by yelling or screaming. And so all three of these instinctual needs are necessary for a child's survival. But the problem is that in this first year and a half, the child is identified so much with the mother and the things around it that it hasn't a developed subjectivity. But as time goes by, after about a year and a half, and it begins to objectify the experience it's having and the people around it, and its subjectivity begins to emerge. That is to say, the sense of the self. And the first kind of self that emerges is a body self. It begins to be aware that it's separate from the mother. A little later, it differentiates further from the other little siblings, if there are such, wandering around on the floor, and it develops, it goes on developing through early life a self-consciousness. As self-consciousness develops, then so does the ego, or what might also be called the false self. And the false self is the child's image of itself that is supported by the experience that are being communicated to it through the parents and other people who are in the environment. So here we are then with a little creature who is beginning to experience itself as distinct and hence no longer completely dependent on the mother. And it realizes that mama isn't going to take care of all its needs anymore, so it better begin to take a few steps of its own. And so this is natural and normal. But the pathos of this situation is that the child, like every human being, is born for happiness, and at the deepest level is this, and at the earliest levels of our life is this desire or this need for the experience of happiness. And the infant, not having a spiritual life yet, tends to identify the gratification of its instinctual needs as happiness. It translates happiness into pleasure or instant gratification. So this is a very interesting discovery in contemporary psychology and developmental psychology in particular. It means that a child is presented with these needs, that it feels an almost desperate need to experience at least some gratification in, and some of them are experienced as withheld or withdrawn, because no parents are perfect. They can't provide 24-hour service to the infant. And so the infant is already experiencing in the bassinet or in the first few years the frustration of its desires for gratification, which it thinks is happiness. And so that means that as any one of those instinctual needs, control or the power to have its needs met, affection, esteem, approval, power, control, if any one of these are withheld in a significant way, then the poor little thing tends to develop compensatory means of avoiding the pain of that frustration or to compensate for it. And some traumatic experience, such as the feeling of rejection, or if it's beaten up by its parents and for some reason they think it's the discipline that a child needs, or if it's separated from the parents, even if a mother has to go to the hospital, the child can't understand why she's going there. All it knows is that what it needed for its affection needs has been removed, so it feels that it's unloved because its source of love has suddenly been removed. So separation from the mother in the first year or two usually has significant consequences. So does becoming an orphan have significant consequences. There's a story about, tragic story about children after World War II, after the saturation bombing of the Allies of Dresden and other cities. A lot of young infants were left in the street. Both parents were killed. And this group of nuns, in their charity, picked them up, tried to find a home for them, and to try to feed them and help them survive. But as their numbers grew in those last days of the war, they were just overwhelmed with the work of taking care of so many desperately needy infants that they consulted with some engineers and the And they came up with this assembly line in which the infants were placed in a line, in bassinets, I suppose, and a bottle would be, several bottles maybe, but at least a bottle would come down the assembly line, and when it got over an infant, it would descend and somehow stick itself into the baby's mouth. And in this way, they managed, a lot of these infants were saved from death and were able to survive. 30 years later, some studies were run on what happened to these little children when they finally grew up. Now, perhaps they graduated to orphanages or certain other institutions that weren't that helpful in giving these children the love that they didn't get. The child is not just interested in the bottle. This is, a human being can only be loved into existence. If the child feels not loved, even if it's not true, then its emotional life is seriously damaged, and its capacity to evolve into emotional maturity is threatened. So what they found was that almost every one of those children after 30 years had been in jail at least once and perhaps was still there. In other words, there was a great tendency for them to become sociopaths or to engage in in criminal activity that was obviously designed to fill the extraordinary and desperate need they had for some kind of gratification. In other words, the normal gratifications were not enough for these people. They had to have an enormous sense of triumph. And I'm thinking in this context of someone who killed, who shot, he was a sociopath, I guess, this very talented son who was in college of a woman who we know, and who later made friends with this young man. But he told her, as he became a little more, less defensive, that he, in these words, you know, he said, when I stood over your son and knew that I had killed him, it was the first time in my life that I felt a moment of wholeness or fullness or of triumph or a sense of exultation. Imagine the emotional wounds that can only be satisfied by that distorted, enormously distorted way of experiencing power. For him, to kill somebody was an experience of the power, the ordinary and normal control over his life that he had never received. And so the story of his early life was indeed horrendous. So when you look at these terrible crimes, mass murders or serial murders, or the extraordinary push or compulsion that some people have for controlling everything, or having everybody admire them, or winning the approval of everybody, or having enormous symbols of security for themselves. These are people who usually have been terribly wounded in early childhood, and the normal needs that they have were severely withdrawn. And the more they're withdrawn, the more likely the emotional life of the child will take years or perhaps never can be healed. Someone like this man I spoke about who shot the son of this woman I knew, he was absolutely rejected and beaten by his own family, and parents had all kinds of troubles and rejections. And so he was so wounded that it required someone with an extraordinary capacity to love. And this woman was able to give him that because she felt God was asking her to forgive this man. And she kept pursuing him in prison, even though he didn't respond to her letters, for years, until he finally did respond. And on one occasion, when she embraced him when she left, she saw this tear coming down the corner of his cheeks. And so, what is more of a triumph of grace? To create a saint, or to bring a tear out of the eye of a stone, of someone whose heart has become a rock? Which is the greater power of the divine goodness? Both are marvelous, but we shouldn't underrate the power that God has in secrecy of healing people, provided he can find an instrument that can love that much to forgive anything and everything. And since there are not too many people like that, and there are a lot of sociopaths, the healing that this kind of psychological problem has is rather dim, obviously. Well, anyway, this little infant that we're talking about is, let us say, he's fairly normal, hopefully like you and I are. And he just has a few objections to the way the things are happening. He doesn't have complete control of situations. Sometimes he cries and nobody comes, and sometimes he gets spanked, or he doesn't get what he wants to eat, and all the other things that the infant interprets. But that here is the basic problem, and if you could only grasp this principle, I think it would throw a great light on what original sin, or sometimes and some Christian denominations call the fall, really means. It means that all human beings come into the world, a difficult process as we've seen, without the experience of the presence of God, which is true happiness, at least a taste of it. And so they don't know what true happiness is, and hence they look for it in the wrong places. Well, theology has come up with three kind of abstract ideas to describe this universal situation. And the first wound of original sin is illusion, that we don't know what true happiness is, or its nature, or how to get it. It's a mystery to us. But we feel the need for it, and hence immediately move on to the second characteristic of the consequences of original sin, which is, of course, concupiscence, looking for happiness in the wrong place. And usually the infant looks for it in the gratification of those three instinctual needs for approval, power, and security. And when it doesn't find them there, then it experiences frustration and afflictive emotions like grief, or anger, shame, humiliation, helplessness, loneliness, desolation. And all these negative or afflictive emotions go off as soon as it experiences any degree of significant rejection of its feelings, of its demands. And so these energy centers then tend to accumulate or grow or expand into a universe, a private universe, or a homemade self with the I or the ego at the center of the universe, around which all its thoughts, feelings, faculties, events, and other people circulate like planets around the sun, so that anything entering into that sphere of influence, or that gravitational or emotional magnetism, is judged not on the basis of its objectivity, but on the basis of whether this guy, this person, this event is suitable or pleasant, or going to lead to my idea of what happiness really is. And hence, we never really meet people where they are, or never even evaluate ordinary events objectively until we take up the spiritual journey, or perhaps go through a period of deep psychotherapy in order to become aware of the dynamics of our unconscious. It's into the unconscious that the child hides its chief emotional traumas and pain, because they're too painful to carry. Normally, emotions can be processed by speaking about them or acknowledging them. But the infant doesn't have a language yet and doesn't know how to say these things. So sometimes they're so painful that they're simply repressed into the unconscious, where their energy continues, but where it's stored in the body and thus interferes with the free flow of the natural energies and grace, and becomes an obstacle to the true happiness and to the transformation that grace wants to give us. And so the inner room has to address this problem. The divine therapy has to do something about this human situation that I call the human condition.